I did a rotation at Children's Hospital in neurosurgery, which was overseen by the premier pediatric neurosurgeon in the country, Dr. Donald Mattson. I was so impressed with Dr. Mattson as a person and as a surgeon and as a teacher that it was persuasive in convincing me that I really wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and in fact I simply stated wanted to be like Don Mattson. But I can remember the moment where Dr. Sweet paged me, and I picked up the page on a hall telephone, and he said, "Paul," he said, "we need a pediatric neurosurgeon at MGH. I can arrange for you to go to the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto," which at that time was the premier neurosurgical pediatric training program in North America. He said, "You can be the chief resident there, and then after that, you'll go to London, England, and you'll be a neurosurgical registrar at Great Ormond Street at the Children's Hospital there." It was one of these moments that is intuitively exciting to you. It's not a thought out logical process, and I immediately said sure.
Here's the whole entire medical house staff during my internship year, and there were only 30 people. You notice that everybody's wearing white pants and white coats, and some of us wearing white shoes. The pants and the coats were supplied. They were laundered by the hospital. And so when we heard that our salary was $25 a month, it was explained that this wasn't so bad because it came with laundry, it came with a place to sleep, and all the food you could eat. So who needed money? But if one was married and had kids, the $25 didn't go far. So they were kind and agreed to raise the salary to $50 for people who had wives and or children. The time that's available to spend with patients has shrunken amazingly, both inpatient and outpatient. I always took a half an hour to see patients, and I still do, although we are requested or even required to see patients in every 15 minutes and accomplish about 10 different checklist things during that time. But I can't do that, and so I don't do that, and so I get paid less. But it continues to be much more satisfying than if we were rushing.
Judah Folkman was my first chief resident when I was an intern. And Judah, as many know who knew him, was a doer. Nothing would stand in his way of taking care of the patient. And he had a patient who required dialysis, had kidney failure and required artificial kidney treatments. And this is in late 1964, early 1965. The Massachusetts General Hospital, believe it or not, didn't have an artificial kidney machine available. And I had come from Colorado, where I had worked in a dialysis unit, and it was second nature to me. And so I said to Judah, if I had a machine, I could dialyze this patient. And he said, "Well, what do you need?" And I said, "We need a tub, we need a little motor, we need a filter." And I gave him the list, and he said, "Let's go." We got into his old beat-up station wagon, and we drove around to junkyards and literally picked up a washing machine and a few things that we needed, and we built an artificial kidney here at the Massachusetts General Hospital in January of 1965 and dialyzed that patient. That was the first patient to receive hemodialysis who was a general surgical patient at the Mass General. Can you imagine with the oversight and the regulations now getting a washing machine? We would have had the police all over us. Where's your permit? Where's your consent? Where's your policy? But this patient was in desperate need, and we were able to help that patient within 24 hours of driving around to the junkyards.
The only way off the farm in those days was to you either go to college or you wind up going into the military. So I went to the recruiting office, which was next door to the principal's office, and I asked them, was it possible that I could join the Navy? They asked me about being an athlete, to represent the 7th Rural Naval Command, which was at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And I went on to become an AAU, SAA, Maryland State, Eastern All Navy, and Desland and Inter-Service Champion. I came to Mass General because I had a lot of experience working around the hospital due to the fact that I did most of my on-duty training in the dispensary area. I was working for Buildings and Grounds. I washed windows from the white 12 all the way down to the basement. This doctor walked by and says, "I know you. You was at the NIH in Bethesda." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, you are too important to be up here doing what you're doing." So I trained to do perioperative nursing, and from that I learned to become a perfusionist, and I received the highest award that you could get in perfusionist. I don't think no one in the world could ever be as lucky as I was, truthfully.
I worked in pediatric outpatient and inpatient social service, and my inpatient work was on Burnham 6, which happened to house the intensive care unit. And in that context, I met with many families with many, many problems, including, of course, grieving over losing a child who was too ill to be saved, but also about seeing many children who were traumatized. That was before trauma teams had been developed in other hospitals, and so I went about developing one here at Mass General. I selected a nurse who was a wonderful, understanding nurse in the pediatric service, and there was a physician, Dr. Guthrie, who was happy to join us. And out of that work came not only the initial mission, which was getting people to talk to each other and work well together, but a symposium where we could invite people from all over New England, actually, lawyers, social workers, physicians, nurses, whoever was concerned. And then out of that grew 2 textbooks. When I think of my work at Chelsea Health Center, I think of working in a community with so many wonderful clients who need help, who are so grateful for the help. And I think of working in a unit which is so wonderful.
Well, I thought originally, going back to college, that I wanted to be a medical researcher, whatever that meant. My second and third years of medical school, I took the year out and took a fellowship here in the Department of Pathology. Then I returned to my third year and fourth year and got clinical training in medical school. And by that time, I thought maybe I should be a clinician as well as a scientist. But then they offered me the chief residency in medicine, and I couldn't turn that down. I mean, that was the sort of summit of my aspiration at that time. And then I joined the staff, and one thing led to another. I found I was better and better at clinical medicine and less interested in research. Well, it's odd to look back on it now, but I was very nervous when I started talking to patients. In fact, at that stage, I was very nervous talking to anybody, but I managed to bluff my way through giving talks and presenting cases, and I found that talking to patients was challenging and interesting because it was sort of a puzzle, told as a narrative story from their part, and I was able to expand it. And I found the detective work and the interaction with patients intellectually challenging, but personally just plain fun. And I think the patients and I related to each other generally very well, and it's a very satisfying experience when you can solve a problem nobody solved before to the satisfaction of the patient and help them in the next step along the way.
When I was looking around at Cambridge and thinking that trying to decide whether I was going to continue my career there or do something else, the opportunity came along to assume the practice of one of the senior cardiologists here, who had been one of my teachers back in the day on the old Bullfinch service, Conger Williams. Now, Conger was part of a group that included Alan Friedlich and Ed Wheeler. Alan and Ed had both been mentors and teachers and so forth back in the day, so it was going to be a real pleasure to join them. And so one time I was meeting with Ed before I came back over, and they actually had an office over in Charles River Park at that particular point in time. And he said to me, he says, well, I think you'll like coming back. He says, there's that great big hospital over there, talking about right across the street, says it's all there for you. And it was true.
In 1964, I was going into my third year residency at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Dr. Alexander Gutman, who was the chief of medicine at Mount Sinai, was interested in my career, and I had lined up a fellowship in cardiology. And Dr. Gutman said to me, you know, Martin, we have cardiologists and gastroenterologists standing on their heads around here. He said, have you ever been interested in dermatology? And I said, no, Dr. Gutman, not really. I said, you know, here they talk about dermatology being wormatology, the lowest form of medical life. But I've always been interested in mast cells and in melanocytes. And he said, well, I just have the place for you to go. He said, there's a man by the name of Fitzpatrick in Boston who's training good internists to be dermatologists. And he said, I think you should really go and try. And if you like it, you can come back and set up a dermatology program here at Mount Sinai. I came to Boston and I had a 4-hour interview with Dr. Fitzpatrick, at the end of which he said, I'll hire you. Well, the MGH was very different from Mount Sinai. I felt that immediately there was a difference in patient attitude. It was extraordinary to me where nurses, for example, without any compunction would stay an hour or two after if they needed it in the clinic. There were no complaints. I went into medicine from law school, and I left the law because I felt that if I did my best, I might never know if I do good for a person or not. And I felt that in medicine, if I did my best every day, I would do good for people.
In October 2010, I was approached by Ronald Kleiman, the chief of pediatrics, to write the history of pediatrics for its first 100 years. And so I took on the job, and the first thing I discovered was that it was not a short little job like I had anticipated. I've been in the department now for half of its life, and I thought, well, I know a lot about it. Well, I knew a lot about the things that I had done, and not a whole lot about what others had done. And in the interval between the time I first came and the time that I'm writing this, the department went from 3 senior faculty to, at that time, probably 30 or so. And many of those in charge of separate divisions, each of whom then had several other faculty. So that took a lot of digging into archives at the Countway Library, at the MGH, and the internet. And then it was a matter of meeting with all of these senior faculty who had come and getting input from them. And I found a relatively new company called Small Book Publishers in Amherst, Massachusetts. And they were just thrilled to be able to do this. And what was fun was to be able to work firsthand with the publisher and his wife, who was the associate publisher, and make it happen.